This is KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the women's room where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good. My guest today is Dawn Dyer, who is a California delegate to Vision Forward, a national women's equity initiative, which is based at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Vision Forward is a national coalition of individuals and organizations working to advance gender equality through women's leadership. We're so happy to have you here today, Dawn. We're always delighted to talk about women's issues here in the women's room.
Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be with you today. Thank you so much, Kathleen, for inviting me.
Before I have you talk more about Vision, I'd like to share a few more credentials that Dawn holds. She is the Ventura County Chapter Public Policy Director for the National Association of Women Business Owners, that's known as NABO, California, and was named Woman Business Owner of the Year in 2018. Dawn is also the founder and chair emeritus of the Housing Trust Ventura County and is board chair for the County of Ventura Continuum of Care. She is also a California Legislature 2020 Woman of the Year, and I must congratulate you on all those credentials. I think now is a good time to explain how Vision 2020, as most people know you as, became Vision Forward. Tell your listener a little about your professional background and then how you got involved with Vision Forward.
Great. Thanks, Kathleen. Well, let's start with your second question first. I began my real estate career when I was 25 years old, based on an inherent belief in the value of real property, and also on the importance of housing stability to the health of families and communities. Felt like many women, unfortunately, I was divorced a year later. And at 26 years old, I became the single mother of two small children living on straight commissions. So ability to be taken seriously as a business person was critical to the survival of my family, as you can imagine. So I just took it upon myself to learn everything that I could about my chosen profession. And in 1997, I co-founded Dyer Group, a boutique real estate consulting and brokerage firm in Ventura. We specialize in land use and development services, brokerage of investment properties, and real estate market analysis. In fact, our research on the apartment market is published by several universities' economic forecasts. And then we also facilitate a productive dialogue to help builders, elected officials, and neighbors work together to create quality neighborhoods in Ventura County.
Wow. Okay. So what is your goal in the work that you do toward equity?
Great. Well, Vision Forward, which is the group that you mentioned, started life as Vision 2020 about a decade ago with an intention to ignite a national conversation about gender bias and barriers in America, and to really work hard to achieve gender equity by increasing the number of women and the power of women leaders to accelerate economic, political, and social change. So Vision 2020 was selected to host the centennial celebration of the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution, which was to be held in Philadelphia in 2020. And that's really how I got involved. I've always had a deep appreciation for women who blazed a trail before us. And so back in 2017, when I started thinking about the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, I really wanted to find a way to leverage this moment in history to raise awareness about women's rights and about the importance of voting. So a friend introduced me to Vision 2020, and I was selected as a California delegate.
Oh, wow. So why is it so vital that we have an equal number of men and women in leadership roles? And leadership has been the man's domain for the most part. So where are we on that?
It's such an important question, Kathleen. You know, public policy really shapes all of our lives. So from local statutes, state and federal laws, or corporate strategies, Decisions are made every day in chambers of power across our nation that impact all of our lives, where and how we live, work, worship, and recreate. Laws and policies affect our quality of life, our education, who we can marry, and how we plan our families. So it's so important that women have a voice. And in fact, the goal of Vision 2020 is to give women that equal voice. We're working to achieve 50-50 shared leadership among women and men in business and government, and to increase the number of women who participate in the political process by voting and running for office. We're also working to advance economic security by closing the gender gap in pay and retirement, and to educate young people about gender equality, shared leadership, and civic engagement.
Okay, well, that's a tall order. Many people think the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, is the law of the land. But is it? What is the status of the ERA and what needs to be done? And why is it so important that we have a law safeguarding women's equality in every aspect of life?
Such a great question, Kathleen.
Oh, well, thank you.
Unfortunately, men and women are not guaranteed equal rights in the US Constitution. The equal rights is an obvious way to fix this fundamental inequity in our nation. And it's very simple. The amendment simply states that equal rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Who can argue with that, right?
Yeah, it's pretty simple. Yeah.
Well,
but not so much.
Not so much. You might be surprised. Congress actually approved the ERA in 1972, and then it went to the states for ratification. But after decades, it lingered in several state houses, and it wasn't until just last year in 2020 that Virginia became the 38th and final state needed to ratify the ERA. But now Congress has to act because the deadline for ratification's already passed. So a joint resolution removing that deadline for ratification was introduced in Congress in January of this year. It passed through the House. Unfortunately, it's been stalled in the Senate. And Kathleen, this is so important because the ERA would be a powerful tool to enforce gender equity by guaranteeing equal justice under the law and by addressing systemic biases that continue to permeate our culture and that create barriers for women.
So you mentioned this earlier, but women really don't have economic parity with men. So is this one of the rights that the National Women's Coalition fights for?
Absolutely. Although the gender pay gap has narrowed somewhat since 1980, it still remained pretty stable over the last 15 years. On average, for every dollar that white men make, women earn 80 cents. And Kathleen, when you look at this by race, we see even greater gender inequality. On average, Asian American women earn 85 cents, white women 77 cents, Black women 61 cents, and Latinas only earn 53 cents for every dollar earned by white males.
And is education, an aspect of this?
It really isn't the key issue. In fact, a 2017 study by Pew Research Center reported that 4 in 10 working women say they experienced gender discrimination at work. And that doesn't even count sexual harassment issues. This is strictly an issue of equal pay for equal work, which we really need to address in this nation.
Right. So women, will take jobs at less pay, or they're offered less pay. So
yeah, in fact, there was a study recently that if women were paid fairly, the average woman would earn $400,000 more over the course of her career.
Which of course affects her, retirement. Women retire with less money and tend to live longer, right?
That's right. Big issue.
Wow. So we've been talking about the disparity between men and women across the board, in salaries, in government and boards representation, corporate leadership. We just mentioned retirement. I wonder if you could give your listener some stats on this disparity.
Be happy to. Yes. It's just so true, Kathleen, that although women make up more than half of the US population, we are not proportionately represented at the decision-making tables in business and government, where priorities are set and resources are allocated that affect all of our lives. So the Fortune 500 list that was released in June of this year reveals that only 41 of America's top 500 companies have female CEOs. That's only 8%, Kathleen.
Oh my gosh, that
And
is
while
low.
Yeah, and while we've made great progress in the 2018 and 2020 national elections, women still only hold 27% of the seats in the US Congress. That's just 144 out of 539 seats.
Wow.
And at the state level, America's 50 state legislatures enact laws and implement policies that directly affect women and their families. But women currently only hold 31% of seats in state legislatures, and only 9 of our states are governed by female governors.
Right. Those are really low numbers. It really, puts a perspective on, where women are at. And we need women's perspective, in government as well as corporate leadership.
On the corporate leadership end, there have been many studies that have proven that when women are included in the leadership of corporations, the companies are more profitable, they have better relationships with their customers, they have a better work culture with fewer issues. So this isn't just a matter of equity for women. Including women in leadership roles is good for the economy, it's good for companies, it's good for our government, and it's good for our communities.
Wow. Well, you sold me. Now, one of the activities that you engage in with local women is a sharing of women's history, specifically a history of how we got the vote. So, is there complacency among young women about the rights and freedoms that they benefit from and were hard won by our ancestors?
Yes, it's disappointing to see many young people who seem to take their right to vote for granted. And unfortunately, many Americans, including young women, just don't know about the history of human right or of women's rights in this
Uh-huh.
country. I love sharing the stories of the courageous suffragists because I want to inspire young people to honor those sacrifices by voting.
Yeah, and they made some sacrifices. I wonder if you could give your listener some examples of the pain and suffering these women endured in order to get the vote. And did they even engage in civil disobedience in order to get it?
Well, I would love to share that. Thank you. I believe, Kathleen, that understanding history is so critical to help us really appreciate the rights we have today. And the truth is that when our US Constitution was written, women were not given equal standing with men.
No.
No. During the first century of our nation, a married woman was legally considered the chattel or property of her husband. Women couldn't attend universities, keep our own wages, or sign contracts. We couldn't even own real estate. If we were to inherit our family's farm, it became the property of her husband.
Oh,
So suffragists worked for 7 decades
wow.
and campaigned to put the question of women voting on the ballot, then to convince enough men to vote to enfranchise women. This was not for the faint of heart, Kathleen. Battalions of volunteers worked tirelessly, traveling mostly by train back then,
Uh-huh.
from state to state, rallying the troops, marching, posting billboards, and lobbying male lawmakers. And during that 7+ years, I'm serious, 7+ decades of the
Right,
suffrage
right.
movement, hundreds of women were arrested for picketing and sent to jail. Many were beaten, endured hunger strikes, and
Oh,
other deprivations. In fact, Alice Paul was jailed 3 times. She was
wow.
brutally force-fed by prison guards for weeks. and
Oh,
threatened to be put in an insane asylum
oh my God, that is
simply
scary.
for fighting for women's suffrage.
Right, right. Well, we're going to have to leave it there for a moment and do a station ID. And when we come back, we're going to be talking to Dawn Dyer about her passion play featuring the suffragettes, historical women we should know more about. Stay tuned to KPPQ. This is KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the women's room where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good. My guest today is Dawn Dyer, who is a California delegate to Vision Forward, a national women's equity initiative. Vision Forward is a national coalition of individuals and organizations working to advance gender equality through women's leadership. Okay, and we're back, and we were just talking about the pain and suffering and the struggles of of the suffragettes to let women. And I can tell you just very briefly, my grandmother got the right to vote just 30 years before I was born. And I remember being, just appalled when I found out that there was a time when women couldn't vote. I think that's why I've always been into women's issues. Let's say, how would you describe the attribute women had that allowed them to continue the fight nonviolently until they won?
Tenacity.
Ah,
Women can vote today because, nevertheless, she persisted.
ah,
Kathleen,
okay.
I just want to share that this was the largest single extension of suffrage in human history, and it was accomplished without a revolution,
Wow.
solely through disciplined, nonviolent action. Leave it to the ladies.
Okay. And that leads us right into the passion play, which is created and directed by you, Dawn Dyer. The play is meant to be performed live, but because of the pandemic, it became a virtual event. I personally saw it on YouTube and was thrilled that women's her story, not his story, is presented in the costume of the times and gives us insight into women we barely know about. Perhaps this here would be a good time to shout out thanks to the organizations that supported the virtual event, and at the same time, let your listener know who backs the Women's Equity Initiative.
Thank you, Kathleen. I am thrilled to say that Vision 2020 Ventura County was created to celebrate the suffragist stories and the centennial of the 19th Amendment. Vision 2020 Ventura County is a coalition of local women's groups, including the League of Women Voters, which was also our fiscal sponsor, American Association of University Women, Women's Economic Ventures, NABO, and other groups. We had planned a half-day Toast to Tenacity festival to be held at the Museum of Ventura County in August 2020.
Uh-huh.
Unfortunately, due to COVID-19, our event became virtual with presentations from each of the groups I mentioned, including the one-act play I created with snippets from the lives of several suffrage leaders. I'd also like to thank California State University Channel Islands, which was our technology host for the event last year.
Uh-huh. So many of us have heard about Susan B. Anthony. That's one woman who made it into the history books. Probably fewer have heard about her friend Elizabeth Cady Stanton. What was her role in the suffragette movement?
Well, Elizabeth was born in 1815. She was an author, lecturer, and really the chief philosopher of the women's right and suffrage movements. Along with her friend Lucretia Mott, in 1848, Stanton organized the first women's rights convention at Seneca Falls, New York. There she presented a Declaration of Sentiments, where she basically took the Declaration of Independence and inserted woman throughout.
Oh, cool.
So Stanton became one of the best known women's rights activists of her time. She spoke throughout the country and collaborated for over 50 years with her close friend, Susan B. Anthony. unfortunately, neither of whom lived long enough to see women secure the vote.
Oh, how sad. Well, I will bet hardly anyone at all has heard about four other women in your passion play, and I'm going to name them. And as long as we have time, Dawn is going to tell us a little bit about them. Sojourner Truth, Lucy Stone, Louisa Capetillo, she actually wore pants in Victorian times, and Alice Paul. And now all four of these women lived somewhat counter to society's norms in order to promote women's rights. You can imagine at the time that women who did promote their own rights were looked at rather ghastly. Would you relate very briefly what was remarkable about these women?
Sure. Well, Sojourner Truth was an amazing story. She was actually born enslaved and was a slave till she was 28 years old.
Oh,
And then she was called by God to sojourn across our country, preaching the truth of his word. She was also the first African American woman to win a lawsuit in the United States when she fought for her son's freedom, who had been illegally sold into slavery. Then Lucy Stone is one of my favorites. She was a trailblazer and nonconformist, college educated, and publicly refused to take her husband's surname upon marriage, for which she was not allowed to vote after the 19th Amendment was passed.
because she took her husband's.
Yeah, she took her
She
husband's
refused
surname.
to take it. Oh,
Yeah, refused to take her husband's surname.
yeah,
Exactly.
wow.
Luisa Capetillo, who you mentioned, was one of Puerto Rico's first suffragists. As a labor organizer and writer, Luisa brought the labor movement into the fight for voting rights. And she also had a little different view than some of the elite suffragists by insisting that all women, not just the wealthy and literate, should have the same rights as men. She was also arrested for wearing pants, by the way, and jailed.
Oh my goodness.
And then finally, Alice Paul was a really critical figure in the passage of the 19th Amendment. The day before Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated president, Paul organized a massive parade of 1,000 women dressed in white, marching down Pennsylvania Avenue. And then she launched the Silent Sentinels, which was a group of women who stood in front of the White House every day with signs saying, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?"
And these in front of President Wilson, I remember from what I've read, these women were there every single day, like for a year or something like
18 months, all year
18
round,
months.
in the winter in Washington, D.C., standing there all day holding these signs. It was really inspiring.
And there's why we say that women are persistent and women are tenacious. The chant of these courageous women when marching is echoed today by women in the Women's Equity Coalition. What are their words?
Use your voice, use your vote.
And you and the women in the local organization have actually been out there in costume, shouting that, marching. Where have you marched?
We've marched in parades, the Ojai Valley July 4th parade, the Camarillo Christmas parade. And on January 1st, 2020, we actually marched in the Rose Parade in Pasadena. There was a float celebrating women's suffrage and 100 women dressed in white, period costumes, marching behind the float. My daughter and I were among 8 women from Ventura County to join that celebration.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. Well, could you tell your listener, we're going back a little bit in time because we have a bit more time. Tell your listener a little bit about being the Ventura County Chapter Public Policy Director for the National Association of Women Business Owners. Now, what is the mission of this organization and how has it personally affected or benefited you as a business owner?
Thank you for asking. So NABO propels women entrepreneurs into economic, social, and political spheres of power by strengthening the wealth creating capacity of our members and promoting economic development within the entrepreneurial community. So we create innovative and effective changes in the business culture, building on strategic alliances and coalitions, and transforming public policy while influencing opinion makers. One of the landmark pieces of legislation sponsored by NABO was SB 826 that requires publicly traded companies based in California to have a representative number of women on their boards of directors. NABO's been just a great support system for me. I've learned so much through the various seminars, courses, and training that I've taken, and really appreciate the sisterhood of my fellow women entrepreneurs. And I'm also committed to securing a seat on a public board over the coming year.
Wow. Okay. So to wrap up, would you speak to your vision for women in the future, perhaps the near future and the distant future?
Thank you, Kathleen. My vision for all women, including my granddaughter, Sienna Grace, is that we can live in a world where all humans have equal opportunity, rights, and protection under the law. I'm really excited right now to be working with the League of Women Voters to conduct voter registration in high school and colleges. And I envision a future when young people use their collective voices to work together. I firmly believe that we can't have a healthy democratic form of governance without an informed and engaged electorate.
Really?
So I'm committed to honoring the sacrifice of those who fought for women to have full rights of citizenship by encouraging all women to use your voice and use your vote.
Oh, wow. And thank you for doing that. So quickly before we end, how can listeners contact you, Vision Forward, and where can they see the Passion Play on YouTube?
Great. Well, you can contact me via email, dawn@dyersheehan.com. And our listeners can view the entire Toast to Tenacity celebration, including the Passion Play, on our YouTube channel at Vision 2020 Ventura County. You can also connect with us on Facebook. Same thing, Vision 2020 Ventura County.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dawn Dyer, for coming in to tell our listeners about Vision Forward and the continuing work toward gender equality in America. This is KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the Women's Room, where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good.